Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed. There's so much more ahead you won't want to miss. And if you enjoy stories like this, share the video and check out the others on the channel. Now let's get started. Evelyn Moore had grown used to the way silence settled in her house, slow and persistent, like dust gathering in forgotten corners. It was a silence that no longer carried the comfort it once had, when her husband's steady breathing filled the nights, or when her children's laughter drifted from room to room. Now it seemed to stretch unnaturally, expanding through the hallways, pooling around the furniture, making the air feel too still. She often caught herself stopping in the middle of a room, listening for a sound that wasn't there, an old habit that no longer made sense, yet refused to leave her. Her life had never been empty in the practical sense. There were errands, pills to take, neighbors' mail to collect on occasion, bills to pay, and the endless little routines of old age. But the emotional landscape had flattened gradually, almost imperceptibly, until she found herself living in a place where the only conversations she had were with the television or the nurse who stopped by once a month. It wasn't that her children had abandoned her. They were busy, ambitious, scattered across the country with families and careers of their own. They loved her. She knew that logically, but love from afar did little to fill a kitchen where 3 chairs forever remained unoccupied. There had been a time when they called her every evening. At first, they were long conversations, updates from work, from school, questions about old recipes or childhood memories, gossip about cousins. Then the calls shifted to weekends, then to irregular moments squeezed between meetings or bedtime routines. Eventually, the phone would light up only for birthdays or holidays, and sometimes not even then. Evelyn tried to accept it as a natural progression of life. After all, hadn't she herself drifted from her parents in the rush of middle age? But acceptance didn't soften the ache when she sat at the table, phone placed deliberately close, waiting for a call that rarely came. Every evening she brewed tea she rarely finished, set the cup near the window, and watched the light fade across the quiet suburban street. The houses around hers buzzed with activity cars pulling in, children spilling onto lawns, couples walking dogs. Sometimes a neighbor waved, and she always waved back, but the gesture felt shallow, like an echo of community rather than the thing itself. Her world was shrinking, room by room, minute by minute, until she felt herself becoming transparent, a ghost drifting through the last chapter of a life that had once been full. Being a nurse had meant she was useful for decades, needed in ways both urgent and profound. She had held hands through illness, offered comfort through fear, and stitched together broken moments with calm patience. That sense of purpose had anchored her through grief, through widowhood, through raising 3 children alone. But now she felt unmoored, as if the world had quietly rearranged itself while she wasn't looking. She worried she had become the very thing she feared most, a responsibility waiting to be managed, a future burden to be negotiated through polite, strained family meetings. The thought made her stomach twist. The turning point arrived on a morning like many others. She opened the curtains to let in the pale Missouri sunlight and was struck by a heavy, inexplicable weight in her chest. Something about the stillness of the house felt suffocating, almost hostile. The air smelled faintly of lavender from an old candle her daughter had given her, but even that familiar scent only reminded her that the gift had been sent by mail, without a visit. Evelyn stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by photographs of smiling children who now lived far away, and felt an overwhelming clarity. She could not continue like this. Her life had narrowed to a slow waiting, and waiting was not living. She didn't make the decision suddenly, but once the idea took root, it grew fast, pushing its way through the soil of her mind with unexpected certainty. She began sorting through her belongings, at first out of idle curiosity, then with a sharper purpose. Every object she picked up carried a memory, the apron her husband always teased her about, the faded crayon drawings her children made in kindergarten, the mismatched mugs they used to fight over. She realized that her home had become a museum of moments she couldn't relive, a place that kept her suspended between nostalgia and loneliness. When the papers regarding her property surfaced during the process of reviewing her will, she paused over a particular envelope she hadn't noticed in years. Inside were documents connected to a small plot of land in northern Wisconsin, a place she had visited as a girl during summers, where distant relatives once owned a lakeside boarding house. The memories were vague but warm, pine trees towering like cathedral pillars, the crisp scent of the lake winds, fireflies gathering at dusk. She hadn't thought of the place in decades, but suddenly the image of it filled her with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Possibility. Selling the house in the suburbs felt strangely easy once she committed to it. She didn't tell the children until the papers were signed, not because she wanted to hurt them, but because she feared their reactions. She could imagine them trying to dissuade her gently, or worse, pretending to support her while quietly discussing arrangements behind her back. The message she sent was brief, apologetic, and carefully worded. She was moving to a quieter place for a while, somewhere she could have space to breathe. The replies she received were polite, surprised, and ultimately distant. No one asked to visit before she left, and so she packed. She chose only what she truly cared about: a single suitcase with practical clothes, a shoebox of family photos, her husband's old army backpack, and a set of dishes her mother had given her when she married. She felt strangely free as she loaded the modest baggage into her car. For the first time in years, she was doing something entirely for herself, something that wasn't defined by the needs or schedules of others. When she closed the front door of the suburban house and turned the key for the last time, she expected to feel grief. Instead, she felt relief, tinged with fear, but relief nonetheless. The drive north unfolded across long ribbons of highway that carried her through shifting landscapes, sprawling farms, clusters of small towns, stretches of forest. She stayed in simple motels along the way, their thin walls and humming air conditioners a far cry from the home she left behind. Yet each night she felt the distance stretch, not just geographically, but emotionally, between the life she'd known and the one she was moving toward. She thought of her children often, wondering if they were discussing her decision together, or if the news had already slipped into the background of their busy routines. As she drove deeper into Wisconsin, the air changed, growing cooler and crisper even in summer. The trees became taller, their shadows stretching long across the road in the late afternoon sun. The landscape stirred faint recollections, vague but comforting, as if her childhood memories were drifting to the surface after years of sleep. She began to feel that she wasn't simply running from something, but returning to a place she had forgotten she belonged to. By the time she reached the narrow dirt road leading to the old property, the sun was beginning to set. The trees arched above her, forming a tunnel of green and gold light. The tires crunched over gravel, and the side of the lake appeared between the branches, a wide, shimmering sheet of silver-blue water, perfectly still. When she finally saw the house itself, her breath caught. The boarding house had once been charming in a rustic way, but now it stood weathered and sagging, its paint peeling, windows cracked, and porch crooked from years of neglect. The roof dipped in the middle like a tired sigh. The yard was overrun with weeds, and the remnants of an old pier leaned into the water as if it might collapse at any moment. Yet despite the decay, the place held an undeniable quiet beauty. The lake glowed softly in the dusk. The wind carried the smell of pine and earth, and somewhere a loon called across the water. Evelyn felt a strange calm wash over her. It was ruin, yes, but it was her ruin. Inside, the house was worse than she expected. Dust coated every surface. Cobwebs hung thick in the corners, and the smell of mildew clung to the air. Mice or raccoons had clearly made their home there at some point. She found scattered feathers, broken glass, and signs of small footprints in the dust. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she opened the windows to let in fresh air, rolled out her thin mattress, set up her camp stove on the old counter, and made herself a cup of tea. Sitting on the floor of the dim kitchen, she listened to the wind tapping against the loose shutters and felt something awaken inside her. She hadn't worked with her hands in years, but the challenge invigorated her more than it terrified her. In the days that followed, Evelyn explored every corner of the property. She moved through hallways where wallpaper peeled like old skin, climbed the groaning stairs to rooms filled with broken furniture, and stepped carefully across warped floorboards that creaked under her feet. The house felt like a living thing, whose pulse had slowed over time, but had not entirely faded. As she cleared debris, swept floors, and opened long-shut doors, she discovered hints of the past old photographs slipping from between floorboards, sheet music yellowed with age, postcards from guests who had once stayed there. It was on the third day that she found the metal box in the attic. She'd nearly overlooked it. It was tucked behind a fallen beam, half hidden beneath an abandoned quilt. The box was heavy, its lock rusted shut, but after a few attempts with a screwdriver, she managed to pry it open. Inside lay a stack of letters bound together with twine, their envelopes brittle and stained. She sat down on the dusty floor, the late afternoon sun slanting through a cracked window, and began to read. The letters were not addressed to her, of course. They were written to the Brown family, the house's former owners, people she barely remembered. Some were from veterans who had stayed in the boarding house after coming home from war, thanking the Browns for their kindness. Others came from widows who had found solace by the lake, or from travelers passing through who had been touched by the hospitality offered here. One letter from a soldier spoke of sleepless nights transformed by the gentle sound of the lake against the pier. Another described evenings spent on the porch, listening to the wind rustle through the pines, feeling alive again after months of grief. And then, as she read deeper, she found a different tone. Some letters were from the Browns' children, strained, apologetic, or conspicuously brief. Apologies for missing holidays. Promises to visit soon, unkept. Updates sent politely, devoid of warmth. Evelyn's chest tightened as she read them. The patterns were painfully familiar. The distance, the excuses, the gradual fading of connection. She realized with a jolt that the house had been filled with loneliness long before she arrived. The Browns, too, had grown old, waiting for calls that never came. That night, as Evelyn lay on her mattress and listened to the lake shifting quietly in the darkness, she felt a sense of kinship with the ghosts of the place. The Brown story seemed intertwined with hers, echoing across decades. She understood suddenly that this house was more than an escape. It was a mirror. A chance, perhaps, to confront the sorrows she had ignored for years, to rediscover the parts of herself that had faded under the weight of time. She closed her eyes and let the sound of the water lull her toward sleep. The house was broken, yes, but so was she in certain ways, and maybe, just maybe, repairing one might help repair the other. Here, tucked between towering pines and the vast, shimmering lake, she felt the faintest stirrings of purpose, like embers catching the first hint of flame. This place had been waiting for her, just as she had unknowingly been waiting for it. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was both exhausting and oddly stabilizing, a rhythm Evelyn had not known she needed. Each morning she woke to the silvery hush of the lake, a sound so gentle it seemed to stroke the edges of her dreams. The air held a coolness that lingered even after the sun rose, and as she stood stretching in the dimness of the old kitchen, she often felt the crispness settle into her lungs like something cleansing. The house remained in a state of shambles, but there was a strange comfort in knowing that its brokenness matched her own. It felt honest. Her first real venture into the nearby town came on the 5th day. She drove along the narrow road that cut through the forest, the trees forming a shifting canopy as the wind moved their branches. The town of Calumet Bay appeared gradually, announced first by a faded sign, and then by the neat row of simple houses lining the main street. There was only one central block, anchored by a diner, a church with weather-worn steps, and a general store with a wooden porch sagging under the weight of old rocking chairs. The place looked as though it hadn't changed in half a century. Evelyn felt a sense of déjà vu, as though she were stepping into a memory she had forgotten she carried. The hardware store stood on the corner, its windows displaying everything from fishing lures to buckets to coils of rope. She hesitated before stepping inside, unsure of how people in a small town would react to a stranger appearing so suddenly. The bell above the door chimed sharply when she entered, startling her. Inside, the air smelled of sawdust, oil, and something faintly sweet, like caramel. A woman behind the counter looked up with brisk curiosity. She was around Evelyn's age, with short silver hair and sharp gray eyes that seemed to take in every detail without judgment. "You must be the one who moved into the old place by the lake," the woman said before Evelyn had a chance to speak. The voice was steady, firm, with only the slightest trace of warmth beneath its practical tone. Evelyn nodded, surprised. I suppose news travels fast here. In a place this small, it travels faster than the mail, the woman replied. Name's Nancy Harper. She extended her hand, and her grip was strong, despite the fine lines marking her skin. How bad is it? Evelyn found herself exhaling a quiet laugh. Worse than I expected. But I'm trying to take it one step at a time. Nancy's mouth curled into something like approval. Good. If you're looking for supplies, you'll want heavy-duty gloves, a proper flashlight, and something to deal with critters. Raccoons love that house. They think it's a hotel with free room service. The ease with which Nancy spoke, the grounded certainty of her observations, made Evelyn feel unexpectedly lighter. She began gathering the items Nancy listed, letting the woman's suggestions guide her. In the process, she noticed that Nancy asked questions, not intrusive ones, but ones that revealed practical concern. Was the roof leaking? How was the plumbing? Did she have insulation? Each question felt like a small rope thrown across the growing distance Evelyn felt between herself and the world. As she checked out, Nancy said, If you need help or advice, come by. Most of us know that house is bones better than the people who built it. Then after a moment, she added, Don't try to do everything alone. That place will swallow you if you let it. The comment lingered with Evelyn as she drove back. She had spent so many years believing that self-sufficiency was her strength raising children alone. Managing a household, caring for patients without ever asking for anything in return. She was not accustomed to the idea that needing help wasn't failure. But here, in this quiet corner of Wisconsin, the rules she had lived by seemed to dissolve. When she returned to the house, she tackled the kitchen first. It was the heart of any home, and although this one was far from welcoming, she felt drawn to reclaim it. She scrubbed surfaces until her hands ached, hauled out rotted cabinets and pried up warped linoleum tiles that had curled from water damage. The work was harsh, unforgiving, but strangely meditative. Each layer she removed felt like peeling back time, exposing remnants of the life the Browns once lived here. Beneath the grime and decay, she found small hints of the past, a child's drawing tucked behind a cabinet, a rusted biscuit cutter, a faded calendar still pinned to the wall from 1978. Her body protested constantly. Her back throbbed, her knees complained, and her hands, once steady and sure, trembled after hours of labor. Yet she pushed through, compelled by the sense that the house was responding to her efforts. The air grew less stale. Light found its way through the windows she'd cleaned. For the first time since her arrival, she felt she was creating something rather than merely surviving. Each evening, she thumbed through the letters she had found in the metal box. She handled them with reverence, as though they were fragile bridges to the past. The words written by strangers resonated deeply. A veteran wrote about sleeping through a whole night for the first time since returning from war, thanks to the Browns' kindness. A widow described finding the courage to spread her husband's ashes on the lake after a week spent in the boarding house. A young musician thanked the family for letting him play on their porch during the summer months, where his music mingled with the sound of the wind in the pines. And then there were the letters from the Browns' own children, brief postcards sent from cities far away, filled with rushed apologies for missing Thanksgiving or vague plans to visit when time allowed. Each one carried undertones of distance, polite but hollow. Reading them gave Evelyn a small, sharp ache. She recognized the tone all too well. It was the same tone she heard in her daughter Rachel's voice when she called from her office. The same clipped politeness her son Michael used when he was trying to hide his exhaustion. The Browns had grown old waiting, just as she had waited. Time had not been kind to their hearts. One afternoon, as she worked in the attic, she discovered a large shape hidden under an old tarp. When she pulled the fabric away, dust billowed into the air, making her cough, but beneath it gleamed the dull outline of a large bell. The metal was corroded, its surface mottled with rust, but she could still make out the engraved words encircling its rim. For all who have forgotten the way, this is the sound of home. The phrase struck something inside her. She traced the letters with her fingertips, feeling the grooves worn into the metal. The bell was heavy when she lifted it, far heavier than she expected, but she carried it downstairs and set it near the porch. She imagined how it must have sounded in its prime, calling guests to dinner or gathering people for evenings by the lake. The idea of restoring it filled her with a flicker of joy she hadn't felt in years. Her first real help arrived 3 days later, though she hadn't asked for any. A young couple from town, Josh and Kelly, knocked on her door, holding a small potted fern as a housewarming gift. They introduced themselves shyly, explaining that they owned the new coffee shop on Main Street and that Nancy had mentioned someone could use a hand with yard work. Josh had kind eyes and strong arms, the kind of person who found satisfaction in physical labor, while Kelly carried an air of gentle creativity, her hair pulled back with a paint-stained scarf. "We don't want to intrude," Kelly said when Evelyn opened the door, "but if you need help clearing the yard or repainting anything, we're happy to come by on weekends." Evelyn was taken aback by their sincerity. She had grown so used to the transactional nature of city life that she had forgotten what simple generosity felt like. She invited them inside, embarrassed by the disarray, but grateful for their presence. Josh walked the perimeter of the house with her, pointing out which sections of the siding could be salvaged and which were beyond repair. Kelly examined the old furniture with a thoughtful eye, suggesting fabrics and restoration techniques for pieces Evelyn had assumed were destined for the trash. Their offer wasn't the last. The following week, a man named Sam arrived at her door. He was in his late 60s, tall and broad-shouldered, with hands that looked capable of building or dismantling a house single-handedly. He introduced himself as the town's unofficial carpenter and said simply, "I heard you've got a roof problem. I can fix it." Evelyn tried to insist she couldn't afford major repairs, but Sam waved her off. "Pay me if you want. Don't if you can't. This house has needed help for years. Someone finally cares enough to give it some." Evelyn later learned that Sam had a son he hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade. People in town whispered about the estrangement with the kind of sympathetic softness reserved for wounds everyone can feel, but no one knows how to heal. It made her wonder whether helping with the house was Sam's way of making amends with the world. Soon more people came. A pair of teenage siblings volunteered to repaint the porch railings in exchange for cookies and a chance to swim in the lake afterward. An elderly woman from the church dropped off homemade curtains for the kitchen. A retired teacher brought over a box of old books to restock the shelves in the living room. With every visit, the house grew warmer, its atmosphere shifting from abandonment to anticipation. Despite the growing support, Evelyn found herself struggling with the letters she began drafting to her children. Late at night, after the day's work left her muscles trembling, she sat at the kitchen table with a pen poised above a blank sheet of paper. She wrote about the house, about the people she had met, about the quiet beauty of the lake at dawn. But each time her words turned toward her feelings, her loneliness, her fear of becoming irrelevant, she froze. The vulnerability felt too raw. She folded the unfinished letters and tucked them into a drawer. Still, each day she found herself changing in small, undeniable ways. She laughed more freely with the people who stopped by. She slept more deeply, her dreams filled with the sound of water and wind instead of the echoing quiet of her old home. She felt her lungs expand with a sense of purpose she thought she had lost forever. And though the house had a long way to go before it could be considered whole, Evelyn sensed something shifting in herself. She was rediscovering fragments of a woman she thought had disappeared when her children grew up and when her husband died. A woman who believed in beginnings, who felt steadier on her feet when she had something to work toward. As summer deepened and the days lengthened, the house began to transform. Sunlight poured more freely into the rooms she had cleaned. Fresh boards patched old holes. The scent of pine filled the air when windows were opened. And every evening, when she traced her hand along the rim of the old bell, she imagined what it might sound like when restored. A call that reached across distance, a message to anyone, perhaps even her own children, that home could still be found if they listened closely enough. With each passing day, Evelyn realized the house was no longer merely a project or a distraction. It was becoming a haven, a hearth around which an unexpected community had begun to form. And though she didn't yet know it, its quiet pulse would carry her toward the next chapter of healing, one that would demand more honesty and courage than she had summoned in years. The summer deepened with a slow, deliberate warmth that seemed to settle into the bones of the old boarding house, just as it settled into Evelyn's own. By the time July reached its midpoint, Much of the heavy clearing and foundational work had been completed thanks to the steady stream of townspeople who had begun treating the project almost as a communal responsibility. Fresh lumber stacked neatly beside the porch, paint cans lined the wall near the kitchen, and piles of crumbling plaster had been hauled away. The house was no longer the abandoned shell she had first walked into. It was a place in the midst of becoming. Yet beneath the visible progress, there lingered an undercurrent of fragility of things not yet mended, both in wood and in heart. It was during a violent storm one night that Evelyn came to understand just how precarious that balance was. The weather had turned unexpectedly. It wasn't unusual for storms to sweep across the lake with little warning, but this one arrived with a ferocity that startled her awake. Thunder cracked open the sky, rattling the window panes, and wind slammed against the house in heavy gusts. She rose from bed with her heart pounding, fumbling for her robe in the dark. When the next flash of lightning illuminated the hallway, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A dark, widening stain spreading across the ceiling outside her bedroom door. Before she could react, a crack echoed through the house, sharp, jarring, and then a section of the ceiling gave way. Plaster and debris crashed onto the floor only inches from where she stood. Dust exploded upward, thick and suffocating. She staggered back, coughing as she shielded her face with her arm. The storm outside provided a jarring soundtrack to the sudden destruction, the wind howling as though mocking her fear. Her first instinct, one drilled into her during decades of nursing, was to assess the damage with calm detachment. But as she stared at the gaping hole above her, rain beginning to seep through the exposed beams, something inside her trembled uncontrollably. She had been so determined to prove she could do this alone, to fix the house, to reclaim her life, to carve something new out of the ruins. But the collapsing ceiling reminded her starkly of the truth she had tried to ignore. She was a 79-year-old woman standing beneath a structure that was older, heavier, and far more dangerous than she had gotten herself to believe. The next morning, once the storm had passed and pale sunlight filtered through the broken roof, she called Sam. He arrived within the hour, climbing out of his truck with his usual quiet presence. When he saw the hole, his jaw tightened. He ran a hand over the splintered edges of the beams and gave a low whistle. "You could have been killed," he said, turning to her with a sternness she hadn't heard from him before. "You shouldn't be working in here alone, not with the roof like this." "I know," Evelyn said softly, feeling suddenly small. "I thought it was stable enough." "It wasn't." Sam looked around the hallway with a critical eye. "There's a lot more rot in the beams than I realized. We need a proper crew for this. I can't do it alone, and you sure as hell aren't going to try fixing it yourself?" The reprimand stung, but she didn't argue. Something in the way he said "we" brought a strange comfort, a reminder that she wasn't truly alone anymore. Not if she allowed herself not to be. Within days, a team of local builders had gathered around the house. Some were professionals who owed favors to Sam. Others were volunteers who simply wanted to see the old boarding house restored. They worked with a quiet camaraderie that Evelyn found absorbing to watch hands passing tools, shoulders lifting beams, voices exchanging brief instructions. The rhythm of their labor filled the house with life. The crash of the collapse had been frightening, but what followed was a reconstruction far more stable, more intentional than anything she could have achieved alone. Still, the incident left her shaken in ways that lingered long after the debris was cleared. For the first time since arriving, she felt compelled to reach out beyond the town, beyond the walls of the house, to the places where her children lived their busy lives. Perhaps it was the fear of how close she had come to harm. Perhaps it was the realization that mending the house would mean little if she didn't also attempt to mend the fractures within her family. Whatever the reason, she returned to the drawer in the kitchen where she kept the many unfinished letters. She smoothed them out on the table, reading her half-formed thoughts and hesitant beginnings. They all felt incomplete, guarded, almost timid. She wanted something different now, honesty, not just politeness. So she began again. She wrote slowly at first, describing the storm, the collapse, the rebuilding underway. Then with a trembling hand, she began to write about why she had come, what it felt like to be forgotten, how difficult it had been to realize she had become a minor character in the lives she once centered her world around. She did not accuse, she simply told the truth. She added photographs she had taken of the house and the lake, images that captured both the ruin and the beauty of her new home. And on impulse, she included a few photocopies of the old letters from the Browns, not to guilt her children, but to show them that distance between generations was not new, and that she hoped they might escape repeating history. By the time she finished writing the letters, one to each child, her hands were stiff and her throat thick with emotion. She sealed the envelopes as though sealing a deep part of herself inside them. When she dropped them into the mailbox outside the general store, she felt her heart thud with a mix of dread and relief. It was a step she could not undo. Days passed before she received any replies. When they came, they arrived as differently as the children themselves. Rachel's letter was the first. It was written in her precise, meticulous handwriting, every line perfectly aligned. She acknowledged the shock of learning about Evelyn's move, expressed concern about her safety, and stated almost clinically that she wished her mother had discussed the decision beforehand. There was no mention of visiting, no warmth beyond a few obligatory sentences. The words were polished yet hollow, like an exquisitely wrapped box with nothing inside. Michael's message came not as a letter, but as a long email printed on office paper. His tone was gentler, though distant, full of questions about her health and whether she had proper heating, in a few lines apologizing for not calling more often. He explained that work had consumed him and that he felt torn in a dozen directions. He wanted to understand her choice, he said, but he wasn't sure he did. Lisa did not respond at all. The absence of her youngest daughter's voice was the one that hurt most. Evelyn tried to reason with herself, to believe that perhaps the letter had gotten lost or misplaced. But deep down she understood that Lisa's silence was deliberate. Her daughter had always taken things more personally than her siblings, had always felt slighted more easily, loved more fiercely, and withdrawn more completely. The distance had grown years before this move, and Evelyn feared it had grown too wide to cross. Despite the painful responses, she found solace in the steady work of preparing the house for the summer festival the town hosted every year. It was Nancy who first suggested the idea of an open house event. "People would love to see what you've done with the place," she said, handing Evelyn a list of tasks to complete before the festival. "And it might help you feel more connected to the town." Evelyn hesitated at first. The idea of opening her home to strangers felt overwhelming. But as she looked around at the cleaned rooms, the repaired floors, and the carefully restored furniture, she felt a stir of pride. Perhaps sharing the space would be the final step in giving it a second life. She began preparing in earnest. Josh and Kelly spent weekends helping her repaint the living room in a warm shade that made the afternoon light look like honey on the walls. Sam and his crew rebuilt the pier so it was sturdy enough for people to walk on safely. The teenagers who had helped paint the porch returned to plant flowers along the front walkway. The yard slowly shifted from wild overgrowth to something resembling the welcoming entrance the house once had. The bell, cleaned, polished, its engraving now readable even from several feet away, was mounted beside the front door. Its weight was reassuring, its presence symbolic. When Evelyn first rang it to test the sound, the deep tone resonated across the water, echoing off the far trees. The sound brought tears to her eyes. It felt like a call she had been waiting for, a reminder that she wasn't lost. Then one quiet evening, as she laid out strings of lantern lights for the festival, the phone rang. She nearly didn't answer it. Calls had become rare, and unknown numbers even rarer. When she did pick up, her breath caught. "Mom?" It was Lisa. Her voice sounded small, as if she were speaking from far away, not only in distance but in courage. Evelyn felt her knees weaken and sank into the nearest chair. They spoke hesitantly at first. Lisa said she had received the letter but hadn't known how to respond. She admitted she was afraid of what her mother's move meant, afraid of losing her, afraid of being blamed for her distance. Evelyn listened, heart aching, and confessed her own fears. They spoke of misunderstandings and unspoken hurts, not in sweeping declarations, but in quiet, halting sentences. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a beginning, a fragile truce balanced on the edge of emotion. When the call ended, Evelyn sat for a long time with the phone pressed to her chest. The house around her was silent, but she no longer felt like she was sitting in an empty space. Something had shifted painfully, tentatively, but undeniably. As the night before the festival approached, the house glowed with warm lamplight and the soft gleam of lanterns. Everything was ready, the rooms cleaned, the porch polished, the yard inviting. The town had poured its collective energy into making the event special. Evelyn felt a mixture of pride and nervousness fluttering in her chest. She wondered how many people might come, whether her children would think kindly of her efforts if they ever saw them, whether the presence of strangers walking through the rooms she had lovingly restored would feel comforting or intrusive. She stood on the porch in the fading light, listening to the quiet hum of the evening. The lake shimmered, reflecting the last hues of sunset. For the first time in years, she felt anticipation instead of dread for the day to come. She didn't yet know that the next chapter would bring surprises she hadn't dared to imagine. Surprises that would test her heart in new ways and ultimately mend it. For now, she simply breathed in the scent of pine and lake air and allowed herself to hope. The morning of the festival began with a kind of stillness that felt deliberate, as though the world were holding its breath before the day unfolded. Evelyn woke earlier than usual, stirred not by noise but by a faint unease that fluttered beneath her ribs. She rose slowly, joints stiff but manageable, and moved to the window. Outside, the lake was a perfect mirror, so calm that the reflection of the sky appeared more solid than the sky itself. The early light spread gently across the water, softening the edges of everything it touched. Even the old pines seemed less severe, their dark needles washed in pale gold. For a moment, she simply stood there, absorbing the quiet as if she needed to fortify herself with it. There had been a time, years ago, when mornings had meant waking to bustling sounds, children arguing over cereal, her husband humming as he made coffee, the clatter of dishes, the happy chaos of life. Now mornings were simple, subdued, shaped by routine rather than responsibility. And yet on this morning, she felt something akin to that long-forgotten flutter of anticipation, the feeling that the day would matter. By the time she stepped onto the porch, the sun had fully risen, and a light breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh earth. She breathed in deeply. Everything around her, from the newly painted railings to the flowers planted along the walkway, seemed to hum with the energy of preparation. The lanterns she and the townspeople had strung the evening before still hung between the porch posts, swaying gently with the wind. She checked their cords, tugging softly to ensure they would hold through the day. There was nothing left to fix, nothing more to mend. All she could do now was wait. The first people arrived shortly after noon. They came in small groups carrying food, folding chairs, and instruments. Children darted ahead of their parents, laughing as they ran across the yard, delighted by the open lawn that sloped toward the lake. Evelyn felt a warmth spread through her as she greeted each visitor. Many she already knew: Sam, wiping his hands on his jeans as he approached with a toolbox just in case; Josh and Kelly with a tray of pastries from their cafe; Nancy carrying a basket so large it seemed to swallow her arms. Others were strangers, tourists, neighbors from farther down the lake, curious passers-by who had heard of the event and wanted to see the house reborn. Music drifted across the yard as someone tuned a guitar. A group gathered on the rebuilt pier, their voices rising in excitement as they tested the boards Sam's men had secured. The smell of grilled food mixed with the fragrance of fresh flowers. Laughter carried through the air like a gentle vibration. Evelyn moved among the people, answering questions about the renovation, telling small stories about what she had found in the house, accepting compliments that made her cheeks flush. Yet despite the activity and the cheerful atmosphere, a quiet hollowness pressed at her from the inside. She smiled easily and spoke kindly, but beneath the surface she felt the absence of her children like a weight. She told herself that expecting them to come was unreasonable. None of them had hinted that they would consider visiting, but part of her had held on to a fragile hope. She had imagined them stepping onto the lawn, exchanging uncertain looks, perhaps even embracing her awkwardly. It was an image she had tried to ignore, knowing how easily hope could transform into hurt. Still, she couldn't help searching the shifting crowd for familiar faces she knew she wouldn't find. By mid-afternoon, the festival was in full swing. The porch bustled with activity. People admired the old photographs she had hung on the living room walls, exclaiming over the way the house had looked in its heyday. Others wandered upstairs, exploring the restored rooms and marveling at the original woodwork that had survived time's erosion. Outside, children splashed in the shallows while adults chatted around picnic blankets. The atmosphere was gentle, warm, blissfully ordinary. It was everything Evelyn had wanted for the house, everything she had hoped it might become for the town. And yet she kept drifting to the edge of the festivities, pulled by a subtle thread of longing. She stood near the porch steps when she heard the distant sound of tires crunching along the gravel road. It was a familiar sound. Cars arrived periodically as more guests joined, but something about this one made her pause. There was a rhythm to it, a slow approach that suggested hesitation rather than eagerness. She squinted toward the road, hand raised against the sunlight. A silver sedan appeared first. The car slowed, then stopped near the edge of the yard. The driver's door opened, and as a tall figure stepped out, Evelyn felt her breath catch painfully in her throat. Rachel, her eldest daughter, stood rigidly beside the car, dressed in a fitted navy blazer and heels that looked impractical for the terrain. Her hair was tied back in a neat twist, as if she had stepped out of a boardroom rather than into a lakeside festival. She held her purse tightly, her posture formal, almost defensive. Before Evelyn could register the sight, a second vehicle turned onto the property, a compact SUV with the back seats filled with bags and toys. Michael climbed out, wearing jeans and pushing his glasses up his nose as he surveyed the crowd. When he opened the back door, his young daughter tumbled out, her tiny hands immediately reaching toward the lake with excitement. And then came the last car, a small hatchback, old but brightly painted. When it parked behind the others, the driver stepped out slowly. It was Lisa. She looked more exhausted than Evelyn remembered, her hair pulled into a loose bun, her clothes wrinkled from hours of travel, but her expression held a timid determination that made Evelyn's heart twist. She clutched the strap of her bag as though steadying herself against her own uncertainty. For a moment the world seemed to still. The chatter of the festival receded into a distant hum, the breeze quieted, and Evelyn felt suspended between disbelief and overwhelming emotion. Her children, her grown, distant, busy children, were standing on the very ground she had feared they would never touch. Rachel was the first to move. She approached with slow, careful steps, her expression composed but strained. "Mom," she said softly, almost formally, "we thought we should come." Evelyn opened her mouth, but no words emerged. Instead, she nodded, tears filling her eyes. Michael hugged her gently, his arms uncertain but sincere. His daughter wrapped herself around Evelyn's legs without hesitation, grounding her with the simple honesty only a child could offer. Then came Lisa. She stood there for a breath, her eyes glistening, before she stepped forward and hugged her mother tightly, the tension in her body melting into trembling relief. The hours that followed blurred into a strange, beautiful mixture of celebration and quiet reconciliation. People welcomed the three siblings warmly, proud that the house had not only been restored, but had also drawn the family together again. The children walked through the rooms with expressions that shifted from surprise to awe to something softer, something like understanding. They asked questions, listened to stories about the Browns, traced their fingers over the restored banister, and stood silently for long minutes in the rooms where their mother had worked so tirelessly to breathe life back into the past. The festival slowly wound down as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Lanterns glowed softly as people packed their things and said their goodbyes. Evelyn's children stayed behind, lingering as though unsure how to transition from polite participation to something deeper. When the last guests left, Evelyn stood beside the porch, brushing stray petals from a table, and felt a strange peace settle around her. The day had been fuller than she had dared imagine. Her children joined her one by one. They helped her gather plates, fold blankets, and carry chairs inside. The chores became a quiet choreography, a familiar memory revived. It felt like years ago when they used to help clean after family gatherings, although now their movements were slower, more careful, shaped by adulthood. Later that evening, as twilight painted the lake in hues of lavender and blue, they gathered in the living room. Rachel sat with her back straight, though her expression had softened since her arrival. Michael leaned forward with his hands clasped, staring at the floor as though unsure where to begin. Lisa curled into one corner of the couch, her legs tucked under her, eyes drifting around the room. At first, they spoke cautiously small observations about the drive, the weather, the food. But then the conversation deepened. Rachel admitted that their mother's letter had frightened her. She had sensed more behind the words than what Evelyn had written. Michael confessed that he had been feeling overwhelmed for years, unable to find balance between work and family, and that he had avoided confronting what he feared might be a collapse in their relationship. Lisa, her voice trembling, spoke about her resentment, how she had felt abandoned after their father's death, how she had misunderstood her mother's grief as distance. Evelyn listened to each of them, absorbing their words with a patient tenderness. She told them her truths as well, how the house had suffocated her after they left, how loneliness had crept into the quiet spaces of her life, how the lake house had felt like both an escape and a chance to rediscover herself. She did not blame them. She simply wanted them to understand. By the time the conversation slowed, the room had grown dim and intimate, lit only by the soft glow of a lamp. The air felt lighter, as if years of unspoken emotion had dissipated into the open space between them. Her children stayed for days afterward. They repaired small things around the house, cooked together, and took long walks along the lake. Evelyn watched them rediscover each other in ways they hadn't done in years, laughing at shared memories, discussing their futures with newfound honesty, inviting her into conversations without hesitation. The healing was slow, fragile, but unmistakably real. Before they left, they made promises, this time not empty ones. They would visit again soon. They would help with the renovations. They would stay connected. And as those promises took root, the house itself seemed to transform once more. It was no longer simply a project or a refuge. It had become a place where people found their way back to themselves, back to one another. Months later, the boarding house reopened, not as a business, but as a communal retreat. Veterans gathered on the porch to talk. Artists came to paint the lake. Families came seeking peace. Evelyn's children helped in ways that suited them. Rachel arranged the finances, Michael built a website, and Lisa organized small workshops and cultural events. Townspeople continued to stop by, their generosity becoming a steady thread woven through the seasons. And whenever evening settled over the lake, Evelyn stepped outside to ring the old bell. Its deep, resonant tone carried across the water, calling out not just to the town, but to time itself, as though reminding anyone who might hear it that home was not lost but waiting. On one such evening, standing on the porch while the bell's echo faded into the distance, Evelyn closed her eyes and smiled. The world around her shimmered with the quiet promise of connection, of healing, of new beginnings. And for the first time in decades, she felt whole. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe for more stories and updates. Make sure to check out the next videos on the channel, and feel free to share this one with friends. Your support means a lot.